Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. This video is going to summarise the whole of the issues and debates topic. This is designed to give you an overview, so if you want more in-depth explanations of any of the issues and debates, you can find a full playlist of videos on each section on the Bear It In Mind YouTube channel. If you want more help with your revision to study smarter and save you time, you can join Bear It In Mind, where you'll find a variety of resources from interactive quizzes, exam paper walkthrough videos, exemplar answers, and much more. The link is in the description. There are 3 issues and 4 debates that you need to know. Let's start by summarising the issue of gender bias in psychology. Gender bias refers to treating a person in a more favourable or less favourable way based on their gender. This can lead to distorted or inaccurate understandings of human behaviour. This bias often results in the reinforcement of harmful stereotypes and the marginalisation of one gender. There are 2 main types of gender bias. Alpha bias. This is when there is a misrepresentation of behaviour because researchers overestimate or exaggerate differences between men and women. An example of alpha bias is found in Freud's psychodynamic theory, where he argued that girls develop a weaker superego due to passive identification with their mother during the Electra complex. This implies women are less morally developed than men, a view not supported by crime statistics, which show men are more likely to commit criminal acts. This illustrates how alpha bias can perpetuate damaging and unfounded stereotypes. Beta bias. This is when there is a misrepresentation of behaviour because researchers underestimate or minimise differences between men and women. Beta bias is evident in Kohlberg's theory of moral development, which was based on a male-only sample but generalised to both genders. When women appeared to score lower, it was assumed they were less morally developed. Gilligan criticised this, arguing that women simply use a different moral reasoning style focused on care and relationships. Kohlberg's theory thus failed to account for legitimate gender differences in moral reasoning. Another example of beta bias is found in biological stress research, where the fight or flight response was primarily studied using male animals. Female hormonal fluctuations were viewed as problematic, so their data was excluded. Taylor in 2000 challenged this and proposed the tend and befriend model, a stress response more typical of females. Here, beta bias occurred by assuming male responses could be universally applied. A related concept is androcentrism. This is to have a male-centered or male-biased view of the world. In other words, male behavior is treated as the norm, and female behavior is viewed as deviant or less important. Androcentrism is also evident in autism research, where diagnostic criteria have been developed based largely on male symptoms. As a result, many females remain undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, leading to inadequate support and increased vulnerability to mental health issues. This highlights how androcentric research can have serious real-world consequences. There are many suggestions put forward for change in this area, but here are a few. In order to reduce alpha bias, a change is needed in the publication of results. This is because there is a bias towards publishing positive results. In other words, results that find gender differences are more likely to get published than those which don't, and this can exaggerate differences, leading to alpha bias. In order to reduce beta bias, one simple way is to not simply have all male samples in studies like Milgram, Ash and Zimbardo, and instead ensure women are included. Another way is not to generalise findings from research with male participants to females, or to not generalise findings from research with female participants to males. Cultural bias refers to the tendency to interpret and judge behaviour in terms of the values and beliefs of your own society and culture. This sometimes leads people to form views about the behaviour of others without any actual experience with them. Universality for this issue refers to the belief that some behaviours are the same for all cultures. A key concept related to cultural bias is ethnocentrism. This refers to viewing your own culture as the standard by which other cultures are judged. Ethnocentrism involves the tendency to judge your own culture as superior to others. The other key term is cultural relativism. This refers to the idea that a behaviour can only be properly understood in the context of the norms and values of the society or culture in which it occurs. In other words, it's the rejection of behaviours being universal. A major critique of cultural bias in psychology comes from Henrich et al. In 2010, who identified that most psychological research is based on participants from weird societies, Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic. Despite their limited representativeness, findings from these populations are often wrongly assumed to reflect universal human behaviour. It could lead to the behaviour of people from non-westernised, less educated, agricultural and poorer cultures being seen as abnormal. This calls into question the external validity of many psychological theories and highlights the need for more diverse cross-cultural research. For another example, let's consider the topic of attachment and specifically the types of attachment. Mary Ainsworth created the strange situation as a technique of measuring attachment, where a mother and her child enter a playroom where they were observed through a one-way mirror during a series of episodes. The strange situation was focused on the idea of separation distress being fundamental to the definition of a secure attachment. In other words, how attached the child was to the mother was based on how the child responded to their mother leaving the room and a stranger entering. And according to Ainsworth, secure attachment is characterized by moderate stranger anxiety and moderate separation anxiety. However, this assumption about attachment is based on one culture. The study was created by a researcher based in America using American participants. As a result, when the strange situation as a measurement of attachment is used to study attachment in different cultures, it can potentially lead to bias. For example, you may remember the study of Takahashi in 1990 that found that during the episode of the strange situation where the mother leaves so that the baby's left on their own, they had to stop the study for 90% of the children because of how extreme their anxiety became, because this was so unnatural and unusual for the children. For a third example of cultural bias in psychology, consider the topic of psychopathology and the definitions of abnormality. Deviation from social norms defines abnormality from the point of view of what behaviours are socially acceptable. This means that if someone behaves in a way that does not fit within what society expects as normal behaviour, then it would be considered improper or abnormal. Research by Fernando in 1998 found that people from Afro-Caribbean heritage who were now living in the UK were 7 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, why might this be? Well, for these Afro-Caribbean cultures, spiritual practices including hearing voices are part of their culture and typical behaviours rather than abnormal. However, the West misinterprets this as a hallucination and therefore a sign of mental illness. This highlights the need for culturally sensitive diagnostic frameworks. However, some aspects of psychology may be universal. Paul Ekman in 1972 found that basic facial expressions such as happiness, anger and fear are recognised across cultures, including among isolated communities. This suggests that certain emotional responses may be biologically hardwired and not subject to cultural variation. In psychological research, it is crucial to distinguish between ethical issues and ethical implications. While ethical issues concern the treatment of participants, such as informed consent, deception, or protection from harm, ethical implications refer to the broader impact that research findings may have on individuals, groups, or society. Some research findings may lead to unintended negative consequences, such as reinforcing prejudice or justifying discrimination. This is particularly relevant in what is known as socially sensitive research. According to Siebert and Stanley in 1988, socially sensitive research includes studies with potential social consequences, either directly for participants or for the groups they represent. Although such research can benefit society and can lead to valuable insights, it also carries the risk of misuse, misinterpretation, or harm to marginalized groups, such as reinforcing stereotypes or justifying discrimination. Let's consider several key examples from psychology. First, Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Bowlby argued that motherly love in infancy is as important for mental health as vitamins are for physical health. His maternal deprivation theory suggested that early separation from the primary caregiver, typically the mother, during a critical period could lead to long-term psychological harm. The ethical implications of this theory are a risk of stigmatizing working mothers who place children in daycare, potential for individuals to internalize blame for emotional or relational difficulties as being caused by early childhood experiences, and the theory may place an undue burden of responsibility on mothers for their child's future mental health. Number 2. Brain abnormalities in criminals. Adrian Raine used brain imaging to compare murderers pleading not guilty by reason of insanity with a control group. They found a range of differences in the activity of the brain in such areas of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which led them to suggest that there appears to be abnormalities in the brain that predispose these individuals to violence and murder. It could lead to the general belief that biology causes criminal behaviour, which leads to the removal of moral responsibility for criminals. In other words, they're not accountable for their behaviours if their biology made them do it. It could lead to labelling and stigmatisation of individuals with similar brain patterns, even if they have committed no crimes, and it raises concerns about preemptive action or eugenic policies targeting certain individuals. Number 3. Fetal testosterone and autistic traits. Baron Cohen investigated the link between levels of testosterone in the amniotic fluid of pregnant women and autistic traits. Although the research was correlational and not intended for use in prenatal screening, it was widely misreported. Some of the ethical implications included how media reports suggested this could lead to prenatal screening for autism and selective termination. The research was misinterpreted, raising ethical concerns about how findings are presented and applied, and it highlights the responsibility of researchers to communicate findings carefully and correct public misunderstandings. Number 4. Intelligence testing and the misuse of IQ. IQ testing was originally developed by Alfred Binet to support children with learning needs. However, IQ testing was later misused, particularly in the US during World War I. The tests, which were culturally biased, were used to rank recruits by intelligence, and some of the ethical implications included how after World War I, intelligence data was misused to promote white superiority and justify sterilizing those labelled as feeble-minded to prevent them from reproducing. In 1920s and 1930s America, several states enacted laws enabling such forced sterilizations. This represents an extreme case of how psychological findings can be used to justify social control and discrimination. This was referred to as scientific racism by Stephen Jay Gould in The Mismeasure of Man. So what can be done about this? How can researchers in psychology deal with issues related to social sensitivity? Number 1, carefully formulate research questions to avoid biased assumptions. Number 2, anticipate misuse of findings and present them in a clear, value-free way. Number 3, manage communication with the media to prevent sensationalism. And number 4, conduct a cost-benefit analysis before proceeding with research, ensuring the potential benefits outweigh the risks. The free will versus determinism debate examines the extent to which our behaviour is caused by internal or external forces that are outside of our control versus being the result of our own choices. Free will asserts that our behaviour arises from personal choices and actions. We are active agents in shaping our own futures. For example, in the humanistic approach, Maslow linked free will to self-actualization, while Rogers saw it as essential to personal growth, emphasising emphasizing client responsibility and autonomy in his client-centered therapy. There are different types of determinism that you need to know. Hard determinism is the view that all behavior is caused by internal or external forces that are entirely out of a person's control. This includes the following types. Biological determinism is the idea that behaviors are caused by internal biological factors outside of our control, like genes, neurochemistry, and brain structure and function. In other words, biology is destiny. For example, Nestat et al. In 2010 found higher concordance rates for OCD in identical twins, suggesting a genetic basis. Environmental determinism is the idea that behaviors are caused by external forces outside of our control that could include experiences, upbringing, and learning. For example, Watson and Rayner's Little Albert experiment demonstrated how phobias could be conditioned through the association of a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. Psychic determinism is the idea that behaviors are caused by internal unconscious forces that includes instincts and drives as well as childhood experiences. For example, in the psychodynamic approach, Sigmund Freud put the emphasis on the role of the unconscious as the driving, motivating force behind our behavior and personality, as seen in Freud's analysis of Little Hans and its link to the Oedipus complex. In contrast to hard determinism, there is soft determinism, which accepts influences on our behavior but maintains we could make conscious choices within constraints. In other words, soft determinism is the view that behaviors are to some extent caused by internal or external forces, but not by coercion, rather by our own conscious choices. For example, social learning theory acknowledges external causes of behavior, such as observational learning, but also highlights the role of mediating cognitive processes, our own conscious thoughts. Just because we observe someone doesn't mean we will imitate them. Next, you need to know what is meant by the scientific emphasis on causal explanations. Please note that it does not say casual, but causal. This is about understanding how determinism fits with science. Determinism is fundamental to science because it focuses on investigating causes of behavior and being able to predict behaviors through hypotheses. The scientific emphasis on causal explanations requires a clear understanding of cause and effect. In a controlled experiment, the independent variable, the cause, is manipulated to observe its effect on the dependent variable, the effect, or the outcome. The key to establishing causality is controlling other variables, ensuring that any changes in the dependent variable are due to the manipulation of the independent variable. For example, in Skinner's experiment with rats, the independent variable was the presence or absence of reinforcement, the food pellets, and the dependent variable was the frequency of lever pressing. The control of other variables allowed Skinner to determine that reinforcement caused the rat's behavior. As such, one strength of determinism is its alignment with the scientific method. Research such as Skinner's operant conditioning uses controlled experiments to identify cause and effect relationships, enhancing psychology's scientific credibility and allowing for the development of general laws. However, a major criticism of determinism is its conflict with legal and moral responsibility. If actions are fully determined, holding individuals accountable, such as in criminal justice, becomes problematic and challenges the notion of personal responsibility. Furthermore, some argue that free will is an illusion. From a behaviourist perspective, B.F. Skinner argues that we think we're making choices, we think we have free will, but we are unaware of our reinforcement histories. In other words, all the ways in the past our behaviours had been conditioned through various forms of reinforcement. Similarly, Sigmund Freud also argued that free will is an illusion. He argued that we think we're making choices, we think we have free will, but we are unaware of how our unconscious drives and instincts are influencing our behaviour. Finally, though, support for the free will view is found in mental health research. Roberts et al. In 2000 reported that individuals with an external locus of control, that's those people believing that life events are outside of their control, were more likely to experience depression. Therefore, this research provides a compelling argument for the importance of an internal locus of control in our lives, which is the belief that we are mostly in control and responsible for what happens to us, and that we can succeed in difficult and challenging situations. We have free will. It could be argued that free will is necessary for good mental health. The nature-nurture debate concerns the relative importance of biological factors, nature, and environmental factors, nurture, on human behaviour. Rather than choosing one over the other, most psychologists adopt an interactionist approach, recognising that both factors contribute to development. Nature refers to the view that behaviour is innate, genetically determined, and passed down through heredity. The nature side of the debate is founded in nativist theory. Nativism is the view that certain skills or abilities are native or hardwired into the brain at birth. Nurture, in contrast, is rooted in empiricist theory and suggests that behaviour is shaped by environmental factors and experiences, with the mind being a blank slate at birth. Research into brain plasticity illustrates the interaction of both influences. Maguire et al. In 2000 found that London taxi drivers who learn the complex mental map of the city had a larger posterior hippocampus, suggesting that while the brain has innate structures for memory, nature, it is also shaped by experience, nurture. Similarly, in research on OCD, genetic studies identify specific genes like COMT and SERT that are linked to neurotransmitter regulation. Nestat et al. In 2010 found a higher concordance rate for OCD in monozygotic twins compared to dizygotic twins, suggesting a genetic influence and showing the role of nature. However, the fact that the concordance rates in MZ twins are not 100% indicates that environmental factors are also at play. The diathesis stress model further supports this by proposing that genetic vulnerability alone is insufficient. A triggering event, such as a trauma, is necessary for the disorder to develop. Cromer et al. In 2007 found that over half of their OCD patients had experienced a traumatic event in their past. Epigenetics provides another example of the interaction between nature and nurture. This field explores how environmental factors can alter gene expression. Researchers discovered that when we experience certain events in our environment, it can leave a chemical marker on our DNA. These markers are thought to turn on or off certain genes. In Diaz and Resler's 2014 study, mice trained to associate a smell with a shock showed a fear response to that smell in future generations, despite no exposure to the shock. This suggests that environmental factors can influence genetic expression across generations. The interactionist perspective is also reflected in constructivism. According to Robert Plomin, individuals actively select environments that align with their genetic predispositions, a process known as niche picking. Imagine two sisters reared together, one of whom is naturally more academic than the other. Each will make friends with people they feel comfortable with and who share similar interests. The more academic sister will most probably make friends with those who share her interests and are of a similar intellectual level. The other sister may feel uncomfortable in such an environment and will make friends with those who share her interests. Whereas another child who is genetically predisposed to be aggressive might choose to watch more violent films, play violent video games, and take part in more physical contact type sports. The holism versus reductionism debate in psychology is about what is the best way to explain and understand behaviour. Should we explain and understand behaviour by being reductionist, by breaking human behaviour down to its smallest component parts, or should we understand behaviour holistically, by considering human behaviour as an indivisible whole? Holism comes from the Greek word holos, which means all or whole, and is the idea that human behaviour should be understood not as separate parts, but as an integrated whole. Gestalt psychology, developed in the 1920s and 1930s, promotes the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For instance, perception cannot be understood by focusing on individual sensory components. It requires considering the entire perceptual experience. Evidence for holism includes the Muller-Lyer illusion, where two lines appear different in length even though they are the same. Holistic psychology emphasizes that behavior and perception make sense only when considered as a whole. Humanistic psychologists believe in the richness of human experience, and so to understand a person, they focused on all the parts of a person's life. To explain human behavior in a reductionist way, for them, would be to dehumanize a person, to view them as less than the complete human being that they are. In contrast, reductionism aims to explain behavior by breaking it down into simpler, smaller components. This approach, based on the principle principle of parsimony suggests that the simplest explanation is often the best. There are two main forms of reductionism that you need to know. Biological reductionism. This breaks behaviour down to the role of genetics and brain chemistry. For example, OCD can be explained by looking at neurotransmitter imbalances, such as low serotonin levels. Secondly, environmental reductionism. This explains behaviour at the level of the environment and is typified by behaviourist explanations that suggest that all behaviour can be explained in terms of simple stimulus-response links. For example, phobias will be the result of classical conditioning, the association of a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, and will be maintained by negative reinforcement. An important concept in this debate is levels of explanation, which refers to the different ways behaviour can be explained. Reductionism can be viewed as a hierarchy, moving from the lowest, most basic biological level through to a broader middle psychological level and then to a wider sociological level. For example, take OCD. At the lower biological level, we could explore the level of serotonin in the brain. At the middle psychological level, we could consider the obsessive, irrational thoughts they are experiencing and how that makes them feel. At the higher cultural and social level, we could consider how OCD is affecting their social relationships. Firstly, to be reductionist is to be scientific. This is because the scientific process involves clearly defined variables. In other words, breaking complex behaviour down to a single component. This reductionist approach allows for cause and effect to be established, and you can only establish cause and effect if you have control of the variables, which you only achieve through being reductionist. In contrast, holistic approaches prefer case studies, diaries, and interviews, which, whilst producing richer, more detailed information, lack objectivity and the ability to control variables to establish cause and effect. Secondly, a reductionist approach has practical applications. For example, breaking conditions like OCD down to the low biological level of neurotransmitter imbalances has led to the creation of drug treatments. SSRIs are a type of drug that specifically increase the levels of serotonin in the brain, which some researchers found to help reduce OCD symptoms. It's only through this focused reductionist approach, where specific individual parts have been researched in depth, that benefits such as these drug treatments are developed. However, some have argued against a reductionist view. This is because adopting a reductionist view leads to a loss of meaning. Consider OCD again. If lower biological levels are considered on their own, other reasons involved in the behaviour may be overlooked. For example, very often the drug known as SSRIs are given to people with OCD. However, this may miss the real causes of a child's obsessive-compulsive behaviour, such as past traumas and anxious experiences. In fact, a reductionist view ignores the complex interaction of many factors which can be seen in the diathesis stress model as an explanation of OCD, which considers how biological and environmental factors interact and affect one another. Therefore, it could be argued that simply focusing on lower-level reductionist explanations fails to fully consider the complexity of human behaviour, as some behaviours can only really be investigated in the holistic context in which they occur. The idiographic and nomothetic debate is about what is the best way to investigate human behaviour. Should we focus on the unique experiences of individuals or seek to establish general laws of behaviour that apply to everyone? The term idiographic is derived from the Greek word idios, meaning private or personal. This approach posits that human beings are unique and should be studied as individuals to capture the complexity of human experience. It does not aim to develop broad generalizations or laws of behaviour, instead focusing on the depth of understanding of individual cases. Well, what does the word nomo mean? Well, nomo comes from the Greek word for law. The main aim of the nomothetic approach is to produce general laws of human behaviour. These provide a standard or benchmark against which people can be compared, classified and measured. It involves studying large numbers of people and trying to understand why they behave in similar ways in certain situations. These similarities lead to laws that govern behaviour that can be generalised to large populations of people. The distinction between idiographic and nomothetic approaches is not just about the focus on individual uniqueness or general general laws, but also reflects the research methods used. This is reflected in how an idiographic approach, with its focus on the individual, gathers qualitative data. This is data that is non-numerical, descriptive, and language-based, and is focused on measuring the quality of something rather than the quantity. This type of data is gathered through research methods such as case studies, which are an in-depth analysis of an individual, diaries and journal records, as well as self-report measures such as questionnaires and unstructured interviews. This gathering of qualitative data puts the focus on the richness of human experience, gaining insight into the behavior of an individual person. In contrast, a nomothetic approach gathers quantitative data. This is data that is numerical, countable, and is focused on measuring quantity rather than quality. This type of data is gathered through research methods such as experiments, correlations, meta-analysis, and observations that can be objectively analysed and involves studying a large sample of participants. To see the difference between idiographic and nomothetic approaches, consider the contrast between behaviourist and humanistic psychologists. Behaviourism is nomothetic in that they produce general laws of behaviour that apply to everyone. For example, part of operant conditioning involves positive reinforcement, which states that if a behaviour is followed by a reward, that behaviour is more likely to be repeated, a general law that applies to everyone. This nomothetic approach is also seen in the research methods that they use. For example, behaviourist B.F. Skinner studied rats in the highly controlled environment of what was called the Skinner box. This allowed him to carefully control and manipulate different variables and measure their behaviour. This enabled him to gather quantitative data such as the number of times the rat pressed the lever and the time taken to press the lever. Humanism, as advocated by Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, reflects the idiographic approach, focusing on individual subjective experiences and employing qualitative methods such as unstructured interviews. We can now be more specific with the nomothetic approach and consider three types of general laws. Number 1, classifying people into groups. Mary Ainsworth's strange situation identifies attachment types, secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant, that can be generalized to populations. Number 2, principles of behavior. General principles, such as those found in Milgram's obedience study, suggest that people are more likely to obey authority figures under certain conditions, such as proximity and uniform, applying it universally. Number 3, establishing dimensions. Locus of control and Isaac's criminal personality theory categorize individuals along dimensions, such as internal versus external control, or extroversion versus neuroticism, allowing for comparison across individuals. So, in this debate, which one is better? Should we adopt an idiographic approach or a nomothetic approach? Some argue that an idiographic approach is better for the following 3 reasons. Number 1, it provides a more complete understanding of the individual. This is because a nomothetic approach cannot find out rich, in-depth information about single cases. An idiographic approach, on the other hand, uses qualitative measures which provide more insight into a person's behaviour, and it provides more meaningful information. Number 2, avoids problems with cultural bias. Because the nomothetic approach is trying to make general laws and investigate how we are similar, this can lead to universal laws of behaviour, which means that behaviour is assumed to be the same everywhere in the world, including across different cultures. This can lead to, and has led to, cultural bias, sometimes referred to as ethnocentrism, where one culture's set of norms and behaviours are seen as superior to other cultures, and are used as the standard by which other cultures are judged. Because the idiographic approach does not seek to produce general laws, it avoids this potential problem. And number 3, an idiographic approach has the power to challenge a nomothetic theory. This is because unique cases can serve to challenge general laws of behaviour. The multi-store model proposed a model of memory that contained 3 stores: a sensory register, a short-term store, and a long-term store. They stated that each store was unitary, a single store. However, the case study of KF challenged this. KF suffered a motorbike accident which led to problems with his short-term memory, where his verbal memory was poor but his visual short-term memory was fine, which demonstrated that the short-term store is not a single unitary store after all, but made up of other subcomponents, one for visual and one for verbal memory. However, despite these strengths of an idiographic approach, some have argued against an idiographic approach. This is because focusing on the unique individual through the use of qualitative research methods can be very subjective. It requires the interpretation of the information by the researcher, which can be influenced by their own opinion and bias. In other words, it lacks the objectivity that comes with a nomothetic approach. Additionally, one of the strong arguments for adopting a nomothetic approach has come from its practical application. This is because by studying large numbers of people and seeking to create general laws that apply to the wider population, various treatments have been created to help people. For example, one of the explanations for OCD is low serotonin levels in the brain, and as a result, drugs have been developed to affect serotonin levels and treat OCD. But rather than being contradictory, some argue that the idiographic and nomothetic approaches can be complementary. For example, the study of memory can be approached using a nomothetic method to identify general principles, but complemented with idiographic case studies like HM, KF or Clive Waring, which provide unique insights into memory that general research cannot. And breathe, that's the whole of the issues and debate topic. For more resources to help you with A-level psychology so that you study smarter and save you lots of time, you can check out the Bear It in Mind website. I hope you enjoyed this video and we'll see you in the next one.